Welcome to the Pivot Point podcast. This season, we are focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Erin Brothers. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Pivot Point, we believe we are stronger together. We are one. So we're actually going to introduce a special guest that I have this week. Her name is Erin Brothers, and Erin comes to us with a wealth of experience. She is Purple Inc.'s Director of Recruiting and Consulting Services and a co-author of the Joy Powered Team. Her top strength is achiever, and she truly enjoys working hard and gains energy by accomplishing more work. Every day starts at zero, and tackling projects big and small gives that sense of accomplishment to benefit her clients, peers, family, and friends. Erin joined the team in 2017 as a consultant. Before that, she was an HR director, in the professional motorsports industry. Ooh, fun. And worked in the healthcare industry for 10 years as a program director and HR senior recruiter. She earned her bachelor's degree from Butler University and an MPA from Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs with a focus on human resources. She has a certificate in alternative dispute resolution from the IU School of Law, and she is a SHRM certified professional and a member of the SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, and Indy SHRM. She was chosen as one of Indy's most pivotal leaders in 2019. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Indy SHRM, a Foster Success Board member, and Carmel Library Foundation Board member, a Pass the Torch mentor, and a small group leader at College Park Church, where she's a member. Lots of exciting things you're working on, Erin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Julie.
Well, Erin, I know we've been trusted allies in this diversity and inclusion space for some time, and had the chance to do webinars together. We're working on an event together this spring with SHRM, and I know I've been thankful to be able to compare notes with you over the years. And what are you hearing? What are you seeing? What's next? And so we're going to cover all that today. But before we dig into all that, let us know, how did you get into this space? How did diversity and inclusion find you, or how did you find it?
I love that question. And my answer has evolved over time as I've gotten to know myself and really seen my diversity journey. To be honest with you, it's really started with curiosity and realized that I've been curious my whole life. I think that curiosity is helpful and healthy when we enter the inclusion space, and having a thick skin doesn't hurt either. So I really get to trace that all the way back to my parents being inclusive, even in a small, mostly homogenous population in a small town in southern Indiana. So appreciating that and just seeing differences, appreciating differences among people, and being able to see that as a welcome or a blessing, really, to me, and how we can celebrate that and find common ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned being from a small town in a rural area. I think sometimes we have a misunderstanding of that, perhaps put a label on that as not being inclusive or not known for inclusion. And so you're quite the opposite of that narrative. And I think it's always fun to dispel these myths and these labels we put on people that aren't fair. A lot of times, being from Indiana, when I do travel to the coast or to other, bigger cities, people will say, wow, you do diversity work in Indiana. That must be interesting. I get this like, whoa, she must be really having some really candid conversations. But, I don't think that's the case. I don't see a lot of differences, honestly. Go to California, to go to New York, you spend time in Chicago, Indiana. It's the same stuff we're hearing,
It is.
I care about this. We're not having traction with it. How do we get our leaders on board with this? Like, how do we actually commit more deeply to the D&I world and to that space? And, Erin, you're like me outside of organizations, but inside sometimes having these conversations. What are you hearing from your clients right now? What are some of the challenges and pain points that people are facing with diversity and inclusion?
That's such a great question. And probably similar to you. It's across the board. I have clients call that want to have conversations around privilege, or they have employee relations issues that are stemming from a lack of diversity or a lack of awareness around diversity. A lot of the 101 stuff that you and I would think of around race, gender, sexual orientation, that type of stuff. I'm pleased to say that I'm hearing more requests for things like unconscious bias and equality and inclusion versus just discrimination or employee relations around that. I have a really cool project I'm working on with a client right now who's hired 100 employees in their facility that have marked cultural differences, everything from race to language to even just some issues with gender. And I'm just loving getting into the details of that to make sure that this succeeds, because they want these employees to thrive in their organization. And so they are doing the hard work to say, help us understand, how can we meet these employees' needs? How can we know what it is that they want? And I'm literally working one-on-one with employees and leaders to help answer that question, which is just one of my very favorite things to do.
Yeah, I like to be on the proactive side
Mm-hmm.
versus the reactive side. Because you're getting like sexual harassment training requests or discrimination,
Yep.
training, or fill in the blank, or even the why does it matter diversity training. It
Yes.
personally bothers me. It's like, wow, are we still there? It's 2020.
Exactly. And I can't tell you, though, how many times I've been surprised by my own stereotypes when I've walked into an organization that have asked me for that type of training.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot more diversity, even if it's just surface level diversity, than what I expect going into a group of, say, construction workers or accountants or even engineers. So I've been pleasantly surprised in that regard, even when it is that 101 training, and really encouraged in that people want to even explore that space when it's really difficult, both socially and culturally, to explore that when what we are bombarded with in the news is all of the negatives and the reactive things that are happening from what could have been prevented by having these conversations.
You're so right. You're so right. And I think parking our own perceptions and
Yeah.
biases before we go into the room, just because they're wanting to talk about why this matters or making sure legally they're protected or mitigating the risks, doesn't mean that they don't have diversity and aren't working active on it. So it is a journey, and all the pieces of the puzzle have to come in to fit on that journey.
So true.
So tell us, I love that story of a client where you're really getting in the trenches and getting to have, more meaningful impact on the diversity and inclusion and culture of the organization, which I know you and I
Yep.
have traded notes on this. It is a cultural shift. It's a transformation. This is not a single initiative. It takes, a long game to drive traction in the space. So what are you seeing as far as clients, people that are organizations that are getting it right, organizations that might not be getting it right? What stories or examples might you point our listeners to that we could learn from?
I love that question. Getting it right, I think, means something different for every organization. And I really like to look at my clients somewhere on that, diversity and inclusion continuum. But the ones I would say that are getting it right are doing more than just your diversity training for the year and checking off that box, right? They're having things that are sustainable, whether that be coaching with their leadership on a quarterly basis, or starting those conversations through things like a book club that I'm doing with one client, where I meet with their 25 managers and senior leaders every month. And we're going through a diversity discussion book just to spark dialogue that they can also then take back to their own departments. And so we're weaving that diversity vocabulary into, their regular day-to-day conversations. Things like really getting in and doing focus groups, because every organization is different. And just because one CPA firm has this issue doesn't mean that the next one is going to be the same, or even if it is the same issue on the broad level, the reasons behind it and the history that's brought them where they are very different, just like any two organizations are. So if I had to pick one thing that how organizations are getting it right, it's that they're continuing to chip away at it, right? They're continuing to do the work. And I think when more people are uncomfortable and asking questions like, why are we doing this, that you're on the right track, that it's getting below the skin, and it's getting deep where people are looking introspectively and asking those questions. We've had this conversation before, and it's hard to turn down an organization that just wants what is that one-time training. You hope to be able to kind of get some meat out of it, and hopefully be able to come back and do some of that follow-up work, because a lot of times it's that second conversation or third conversation or fourth conversation when someone's really open to sharing what's going on in their department or an issue that they're having personally, or amongst a leadership team or something like that, where you're likely not going to raise your hand in an hour-long training or a 2-hour workshop that happens one time.
Yeah. One time is not enough for a sustained behavior change.
Right.
Enough to undo years of behavior, right?
Exactly. And honestly, it can do more damage than good, if I'm being completely candid, because people see that that's just a check the box, and they would feel that it's better off to not even start the discussion, especially if people are willing to put themselves out there and then nothing comes of it. So you start the conversation, and then it's very obvious that the door has now been closed, and that's the end of the conversation.
Right. We opened it, now it's closed again. Go back to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think organizations, best of intentions, are like, hey, we just have time this year for a 1-hour unconscious bias training. And it's always funny when people want to start there. I think you're right. Once you get deeper and digging in, that's a great topic to get to. But people have to understand why this matters, what the expectation is of me in this process, right? What specifically am I being asked to do differently, do more of, do less of, and then have the tools so that people can kind of meet people where they're at, so they can develop some of these skills. Because something like, we were comparing notes for the episode, as something like vulnerability as an ally, as somebody to be engaged in this conversation, is really important. We're always trading, I know, saying like, oh gosh, here's a time when I could have done it better, or hey, here's something I'm learning still. And that's not easy. And I think people need tools to understand how to cultivate these skills and come along in the process. So it's not a one done. It's not a check the box. There's a series of intentional events that can really help create that inclusive wrapper of a culture.
Yeah, because people have to believe that it's real, and they see that through consistency. They see that when you do the second or the third or the fourth thing. So I always encourage clients to try at least do quarterly events. That doesn't need to be me. That I recommend lots of different speakers or opportunities for people to engage. And I think that it's great to see diversity and inclusion as a whole, but it really does mean something different to everyone, even just when you say those words. And whether people automatically think of gender or race or disability or whatever issues that come to mind, it's crucial to understand that's one component of diversity, but that doesn't define diversity. And I think taking those steps to include things like LGBTQ issues, to include things like disabilities awareness, to understand things like gender and race are all important, and they should all be included, but not one over the other, or one without the other. So.
Yeah. And I think giving people the freedom to have a personal definition around it, but also have an anchor, a line in the sand of what we mean by this as an organization.
Absolutely.
One of the most critical exercises for an organization to do is to think about their customer base. Who do you do business with most often? And how are we reflecting those values, those experiences, those diversity dimensions in our team, and not just our frontline employees, but our middle band all the way up to the top? And oftentimes we don't mirror what our customers look like, think like, behave like, and that's a problem. And so, really defining when we say diversity and inclusion, we mean these things. We mean these experiences, these behaviors. And what's really nice about it, because you're right, everyone goes to race and gender because we can see them, or we think we can't always.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many invisible factors too that then you get a lot more inclusive of, what I'd call your allies, or the people that don't see themselves as a part of the diversity conversation. They now can say, hey, oh, I've got something to offer here. I have a diversity dimension, or I have a different perspective than the rest of the team that might be helpful. So really broadening that so that people can feel included, not just the underrepresented groups. And then I love what you said, Erin, too, about, it's not that you and I want to come in and keep speaking to organizations quarterly, selfishly we do, but what we know, encourage my clients to too, like, hey, you don't have to hire me to come back and have this conversation every month or quarter or year. But there are wonderful podcasts out there. There are books, like you said,
Yes.
book club example. There are TED Talks. There are so many things that you could just drop right into an existing meeting and have a 5-minute conversation about, hey, what'd you think about that podcast, that TED Talk, that video, whatever it is. There's so much content at our fingertips that we are really passionate about sharing that with people so you don't have to always hire a speaker. But I think there are tools out there. So you mentioned a book club. I'm curious, what other kind of do-it-yourself tools might you point our listeners to if they want to have this conversation, but maybe it's just they want to sprinkle it into existing meetings or find existing tools out there? What are some of the things that you see success with your clients?
That's a great question too. There's some exercises that I think a lot of people have the ability to lead. I think that dimensions of difference is a good one, and I think you can really just Google that and find it. That's one that I think helps people understand when we're talking about our biological differences versus our organizational differences, and why it's easy to talk about differences when I'm an IU fan and you're a Purdue fan, but it's really hard to talk about differences when we're talking about things as close to us as biological differences. And why people get confused when it's okay to have differences in one of those dimensions, but it's not okay to have differences in another dimension, and how the conversation, the attitude, the openness changes depending on that dimension and depending on how close it is held to the vest for you. So that's one that I love. As well as just there's an exercise around stereotypes that talks about things you've ever thought, felt, heard about, and then you fill in the blanks. And it's whether that be, white women or Latino men or someone in the LGBTQ plus community. And then you really think about you talking about your client base and what you're looking for in a customer, or what you're looking for in a new employee, or what you're looking for in recruitment. And if you're matching up those things with people in these groups that you don't currently have relationships with or access to or resources from, what are you going to do to get those, right? How are you going to make those connections? Maybe your networking needs to be broadened. Maybe your professional development needs to be in a new area this year. The places you're recruiting needs to change or be added to. But I think it takes us having that shift. We have to have that aha moment or that shift to see. Had a really cool event that I didn't speak at. I hosted an event for a client, and we focused on disabilities. And one of my speakers works with the Autism Society of Indiana, and he actually is on the spectrum, but connected with a lot of people in the organization as the parent of someone with a disability, and the stress that parents of kids with disabilities have, and really how they bond together in that. Because here you are still working a full-time job and trying to support your school-age child or your college-age child or your adult child, and what that means as the parent of a child or a student with a disability, and just a lot of the burden and the just the stress that they carry in that. which was a really cool connection because, again, like you said, you don't always think, oh, I have this difference, or I have, this area of diversity that someone else doesn't have. But to be able to come together and say, oh, there's 6 other people here that also, think or feel the way that I do, or at least have thoughts around it because of our membership in this particular group.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And it's just so fun when something like networking, for example, you raise a really good point. Think about the networking groups you spend a lot of time with. Think about the people you spend a lot of time with. Chances are they resemble you a lot more than
Exactly.
dimensions of difference. And how can you broaden that, right? How can you put yourself in places that might be a little uncomfortable, but just like your story illustrates, you come out on the other side of really expanding as a human.
Mm-hmm.
I find it's hard sometimes to find places where, it's more predominantly people of color, for example, or people with disabilities. But if you try and you ask around, especially if you know somebody that is of that diversity dimension, you ask them where you could get to know more people like that, they will
Yeah,
know where to go.
exactly.
Um, I love it. One of our colleagues, Erica, that's been on the podcast recently as well, she says, like, go to a church that's different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, go to a grocery store in a different area. Go
Yeah.
get your hair cut somewhere different. I mean, there's so many different ways outside of a formal networking scenario where you can expand your horizons. And I know I had an experience a few months ago. I went to an author book release that one of my mentors had invited me to. And I remember stepping across the threshold, and it was just so jarring how different I was than the rest of the people there.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought at first, I can totally understand with somebody that this is hard for, because there's kind of a human primal response of like, whoa, I look different than everybody. It was primarily people of color. So it was
Mm-hmm.
very stark and in my face. And then I thought, wow, this is cool. Instead of thinking, oh boy, am I in trouble? Or,
Yeah.
kind of the instinctual response of like, I am different than everybody. And then I thought, wow, I don't get to do this very often. I need to do this more. And I learned so much in that short period of time by being exposed to difference that I remind myself it's hard. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. So this is hard. How do I put myself in those brave spaces? And because I'm going to be better on the other side of it.
I totally agree. And it can be something as simple as going to a different restaurant, right? I mean, go to Patty's Jamaican restaurant, or
Mm-hmm.
go to Abyssinia. We have Ethiopian restaurants here, Chapati's Pakistani. I mean, even, Thai cafe, if you've never had Thai food. Just thinking about getting out of what your norm is, and doing something different, trying something different, is a really cool start, especially if you don't know where to start. Your comment made me think about when I was an intern at Butler. I worked for the Martin Luther King Center, and I remember the first time going into the Missionary Baptist Church with my executive director, and I was definitely the minority in that space,
Mm-hmm.
and very similar experience. But it really helps you go, man, this is what my brothers and sisters deal with when they walk into work, or when they walk into a lot of, places of business and organizations, and feeling what that feels like, I think, is really important. For me personally, as I look back through my career, I've been on a diversity journey the entire time. I started my career working with Crossroads, helping people with disabilities get jobs. I saw myself as an employment consultant, but I was really a diversity agent, and helping businesses understand why, employee engagement will actually boost by having someone with a disability in the workplace, and learning to accommodate and help others is so important. I went to work as a recruiter for a small hospital just east of Indianapolis, and started a diversity discussion group around generations in the workplace. I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
hospital had 16-year-olds working alongside, 68-year-olds in 5 different departments. And there were a lot of, internal discussions and employee relations that came out of that. But being able to talk about it and celebrate it versus what these kids don't know, or my grandma doesn't know working next to me, kind of a thing. I worked with socioeconomic disadvantaged kids and programs through St. Vincent, through the Area Health Education Center, and then even working for Chip Ganassi in motorsports racing. I helped increase our female hiring to double digits for the first time. And
Hmm.
when you have a female mechanic and a female race engineer and a female pilot working alongside what's typically been the boys club for a very long time, you start to see some changes in your workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. And all those pieces of the puzzle, right? And it's nice that you have layered in there different dimensions of diversity, different layers with disabilities, with gender, race. All those experiences, I think, really help broaden the lens. And so for our listeners, there are ways that you can weave this in every day as well. And simply just asking yourself, like, well, what people am I not spending time with? What experiences am I not having? And how could I have set a goal for myself once a month. I do something, like you said, go to a different restaurant, for
yeah.
example. It really does. And on the other side of it, again, you definitely get deeper, richer experiences that help you be better and just have a more holistic approach to life. I know I always learn that way.
I agree. One of the cool things for us, I think, Julie, too, is that this isn't just in the workplace anymore. My church has a diversity disciple discussion group, and the rich teaching that I get out of that is, there's nothing compared to that. When
Mm,
the people that worship next to, the people that you know you meet with on a weekly basis are able to share their experiences with you, I think adds a whole nother meaning. So
mhm.
look at places where you spend your time or volunteer or worship or whatever you choose to do, to be able to connect diversity in that way.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
think it's really important.
Yeah. Look for it everywhere. Weave it into those everyday experiences. So, Erin, our listeners are always interested, and you and I are always asking each other this: what's next? Where does D&I go from here? 2020 and beyond. If you had a magic, wand or crystal ball or whatever you had to kind of see where this is headed, what trends do you see for the future?
Man, if I had a magic wand, my magic wand would move us from D&I to equity.
Yeah.
And that the conversation is no longer just about discussing our differences, but moving that, from the differences conversation to inclusion and equity. Things like pay transparency, and gender diversity, that moves to a conversation about inclusion at the leadership level, and not just talking about that. We see the needle moving, and we're starting to see that, but I would really like to see it not take 3 or 4 more generations to get to a place that we're working on today.
I know it's such a long game, and it requires so much patience. And I'm admittedly not the most patient person. Um, but when I saw, just from a gender perspective, since that's where I got my diversity start, something like the Catalyst report, I just saw the 2020 Women in Leadership report, and I could swear it's exactly the same as when I first started studying this,
Yeah.
5 to 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, wow, we haven't moved at all. Like, it's stagnant. That's the hard part of this conversation. So I think you're right. Diversity is really about those dimensions of difference and being aware of differences and embracing differences. Inclusion is really creating that sense of belonging around diversity. And then that next layer, like you said, the equity part, is that we're actually behaving and have systems in
Right.
place that are treating people equitably.
Absolutely. And we know that diversity equals innovation, but I
Mm-hmm.
believe we're coming to a critical point where employers can no longer ignore, because of the lack of candidates out there,
Right.
without expanding their lens and who they recruit, where they recruit, how they recruit. And so you'll start to see that. And I think that regardless of what that area or dimension of diversity is, you'll see the output of that
Yep.
once they start working in that space. So we
Yep.
know that it's better for the bottom line. There's countless studies that are out there that talk about how diversity equals innovation, more productive teams, and better
Mm-hmm.
outcomes, not to mention, like what you said earlier about our employee base reflecting our client base or our customer base.
Yeah.
People care about that. They want that. So
Mm-hmm.
it drives business. It will ultimately drive behaviors of our employers. So
Right. It does seem like this challenging thing. Like, how do we know about all these great business results? Harvard's been reporting on this for over a decade, and
years,
there's
yes.
countless studies that say the same thing over and over again. It's like, but there's no traction. Why is that? And I think to your point, especially once I think a few organizations really emerge that are getting this right. I mean, there's pockets, right, that we can see in our communities, and there's some flagship, larger global organizations that have to your point, to attract the base of employees that they need. But once we start seeing like consumer pressure, and we're starting to see this in pockets with attorneys, law
Yes.
firms are getting a lot of pressure for this example. For example, banks, healthcare, because a majority of the financial decisions are made by certain types of people that aren't reflected at the top, and so this pressure. Although I hope it comes with a positive intent along with that pressure isn't knee jerk, that there's, okay, this is the right thing to do for business. We want to do this because there's a human case, not just the business case. So yeah, that equity piece, I agree with you, Erin. Let's hope that's in our magic wand in the future. So if we could, just in the spirit of kind of wrapping this up on a high note, Erin, if you had one thing that you would offer, we've given so many ideas to our listeners of things they can do to participate in this conversation and to lean in. What would be one thing you would offer? One, tangible tool, idea, strategy that people could step into and do, and on the other side of it, learn to be more inclusive and embracing diversity.
Hmm. Julie didn't pay me ahead of time to say this, but I'd say pick up Lead Like an Ally.
Oh, that's so sweet of you.
Really, because anyone can do that. And I know that there are a lot of people that feel like they're excluded from the diversity conversation. And I think that having tools like Lead Like an Ally, the Joy Powered team discusses that as well, how you can use your strengths to bring that, including diversity, to your team. But really doing that self-assessment first, and finding what your own hidden biases are, finding what your own blind spots are, to be able to then come up with some strategies that can help foster inclusion in your organization. So
yeah, it's not a one size fits all, right? And so it's looking at something like the implicit association test through Harvard. It's free, it's anonymous, it takes 10 minutes per dimension. Implicit.harvard.edu. I mean, then you can get a sense of your blind spots, and then you know where to focus on and where to work. And you don't have to tell anybody about it. These are things you can do on your own. And if you feel like you want to share, or create some safety around it with your team, that's great. But getting that self-assessment up front, that's great. And you're right, the Joy Powered books that y'all have to create, inclusive workspaces, and Lead Like an Ally, I think, can be great book club discussions, just like you're having with your clients. So if nothing else, pick up a copy of both, and we'll link to those in the show notes. And Erin, it has been such a pleasure to be with you today. I always learn when I speak with you, and I'm so thankful that you're in our community sharing this important message.
thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50-plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? And you can sign up for the complimentary 7-day preview of the new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order our new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button and connect with me on LinkedIn. Simply search Julie Kratz. KRATZ. We post daily. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.